Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar called Master the Art of Interviewing, hosted by jobs.ac.uk. Jobs.ac.uk are an international jobs board for careers in higher education, and they're also a career advice source with resources, articles, and webinars to help support your career development. Today, we're going to be looking at how to improve your interviewing skills. But before that, I'm going to just give a quick introduction to myself. For those of you who joined the CV workshop in December, there's going to be a bit of repetition here. Not too much has changed in my life since then. But my name is Cathy Balfe, and I'm a career coach based in Limerick in Ireland. I also worked and lived in the UK for 8 years, from 2010 to 2018. I have experience of a couple of career changes behind me, and I also did a stint in academia. So I pursued a PhD in economics in UCL, which I graduated from in 2015. And shortly after that, I retrained as a careers advisor. So I started my career there with the University of London, working to support students' career development. While there, I successfully completed a postgraduate diploma in career guidance with the University of Warwick, and I'm also a registered career development professional with the Career Development Institute, also in the UK. I set up my own career coaching business then called Career Coach Me in 2019, and since then I've worked with well over 500 individuals, helping to support their career development. And I've had the opportunity to work with clients across a really wide range of industries, including academia, the healthcare sector, the public sector more generally, and industries including IT, finance, the legal profession, retail, real estate, and the arts sector. There's 3 services I offer clients. One is help around career guidance, so deciding what they want to do. Secondly, it's help writing CVs, cover letters, and application forms. And the final thing is this interview coaching piece. And I've worked with over 200 clients, helping support their interview preparation since I started my own company in 2019. And I've also supported a lot of students in interview preparation during my time at the University of London. So hopefully all of this experience means that I have some tips to share with you in terms of how to approach interviewing and how to develop those skills. So looking at the agenda then for today, so we're going to learn this 4 P's approach to interviewing. Okay, and the 4 P's stand for, first of all, predict, so anticipating common interview questions. The second P stands for prepare, so developing clear, structured, and impactful responses. The third P is practicing, okay, so rehearsing your answers beforehand. And the final P is psychology, okay, so looking at the benefits of positive psychology in your interview performance. We'll then move to some common interview worries that come up time and time again with my clients. We'll then move to a Q&A section. So first of all, thanks everybody for registering and attending today. Thanks also to those of you who pre-submitted questions that have been sent on to me. Quite a lot of those questions will be covered as I go through the webinar material. But for those ones that were maybe a bit more individual, I've kept them for a Q&A section later on in the webinar. If people have additional questions that they want to ask, feel free to pop them into the Q&A box there in Teams. And time and knowledge permitting, I'll try and come to them later on during the webinar as well. And then finally, we'll wrap up. Okay, I thought we'd do a little bit of an icebreaker first. So it would be great if you're comfortable to share in the chat box, maybe a bit about where you're calling from. Also, how many interviews you've had to get a sense of your experience there. And also, how do you feel about interviews? So if it was me, I might say Limerick, 5+, somewhat confident about interviews. So if people are happy to share, it would be great to get a bit of a sense of where people are coming from. I'm into my chat box here to see if there's any answers coming in. Okay, so great to see a range of experience there. So lots of people have had 3+ interviews. Somebody's saying, I hate interviews, somewhat nervous. Okay, so hopefully people who are feeling a bit nervous or that they hate interviews, hope we can shift them up that scale a little bit to feeling a little bit more confident about interviews or something maybe they at least don't hate. Okay, so loads of responses coming in there, everybody. So thanks for sharing. Somebody calling from Sydney, I love it. Okay, thanks everybody for sharing there, and great to get a bit of a sense of where people are coming from. Okay, it would be great as well if people have maybe a piece of paper and a pen beside them as we go through the seminar as well, because there might be some bits where I'm getting you to do some other kind of interactive activities to maybe make it a bit more interesting, keep you guys awake, but also to maybe help that learning a bit more as well. Okay, so looking at this 4P approach again, so these building blocks of doing well at interview, this is what we're going to go through now one by one at this section. So we're going to look at predicting, preparing, practicing, and positive psychology. But first of all, let's look at how do we predict interview questions. Okay, so the first place I always tell people to start with is the job description. Okay, so the job description is usually a pretty detailed outline of what's going to be involved in the role, but also like sometimes the essential skills and experience and education that that employer is looking for, as well as possibly desirable skills and experience as well. So here I've come up, or I've copied this job description from jobs.ac.uk. So this was for a program coordinator of the Warwick Business School that was advertised a couple of weeks ago. And I'm not going to read through all of this, but what I might get you guys to do just is to take 2 or 3 minutes and just read through this yourselves and make a little note of any of the skills or requirements that you pull out of this job description. So we'll take about 2 minutes to do that. If you can note any skills they might be looking for here, any experience or other things of note that is significant here. Okay, so I don't expect people necessarily to have gotten through all of that, but hopefully you've pulled out a couple of key skills that might be important for this role. I've highlighted some here that I pulled out, right? So things like high quality administrative support, customer skills, proactive approach, problem solving skills, able to adapt to change quickly, delivering a great service to students, and so on. So there's quite a lot of skills here they've noted in this job description. And then the next step is predicting interview questions linked to each of those skills. So you can see I've come up with a set of 9 interview questions linked to each of those skills that I've highlighted. Right, so the first question here I have, can you tell me about your administrative experience relevant for this role? And you can see that that's linked to this part here that I flagged, high quality administrative support, and also down here, well-developed administrative skills. Okay, so for each thing that I've flagged, I've come up with an anticipated question. The second one here, for example, can you provide an example of a time when you provided excellent customer service? We're looking here at question 2, so you can see customer service skills are mentioned here, and here, and here, right? So customer service skills are mentioned 3 times, so you're probably going to be pretty likely to be asked a question on that. And we'll go through one more. Can you tell me about a time when you had to manage multiple competing priorities? And looking down here, question 3. So this is linked to what they talked about here, this busy environment. So often when you have job descriptions talking about a busy environment, you might anticipate a question around multitasking. Okay. So another tool that I think is really helpful here is to potentially use ChatGPT. So hopefully everybody's familiar with this at this stage. But you can give ChatGPT a prompt. So for example, give me 10 likely questions for this job description. And this is something that I fed ChatGPT earlier on. So you said, give me 10 likely interview questions for this job description, program coordinator. So I've pasted in the job description there. And you can see that there's a list of interview questions that ChatGPT generated. So I've just done a screenshot here, so not all of them are here, but it did give me those 10. And let's see, can you give me an example of a time when you provided exceptional customer service in a busy environment, right? So we'd also anticipated a question around that. So I also think that that's quite a good one. How do you ensure clear and professional communication when responding to queries from students, academics, or colleagues? So one around kind of that strong interpersonal written communication skills. So having gone through that, I read through them and I think that they look pretty accurate as well. So ChatGPT can also be a good way of anticipating possible interview questions. And actually, I was sitting down talking to a recruiter who I know just personally on Tuesday, and I was talking to her about this webinar, and she told me that she uses ChatGPT to come up with a list of possible questions to use in her interview. So, it's quite interesting to know that recruiters are also using this tool to potentially come up with these questions. I also have this note here, right? It's really important to save a copy of your job description, right? So if you're applying for a job, it might have a closing date of next week, but you might not get called to interview until after that date, at which point you might no longer be able to access this job description. And it's so important for anticipating those questions. So make sure you are saving a copy of that job description for those jobs that you're applying for. Okay, second way of predicting interview questions is just using web search, right? So you can go onto Google and maybe say, likely interview questions for work, business school, for example. And you might come up with resources like glassdoor.co.uk, Reddit, or there might be other resources or industry-specific websites that might have information on type of interview questions that might come up either for specific roles or with specific companies. And yeah, I also think a nice thing to do here is to search common interview questions or difficult interview questions as well, just to kind of build up your understanding of the types of interview questions that might be likely. It's good to be aware of the different types of interview questions. Again, just to kind of understand the type of questions that might come up. So for example, there's background questions that might ask you, tell me a bit about yourself or talk me through your CV and your education and experience. There's motivational questions. So for example, why are you interested in working here? Or why are you interested in this particular role? Strengths-based questions. So for example, tell me your top 3 strengths or tell me your biggest weakness. There's commercial awareness questions, so things like what do you know about our industry and the recent trends, who are our biggest competitors, who's the CEO of the company, right? Things like this. You might also get questions around salary expectations, and there's also standard end of interview question, which is, do you have any questions for us? Also here, I used a ChatGPT prompt. So I said, give me a list of common interview questions, including background, motivational, commercial awareness, strengths, typical end of interview questions for the role. And again, you can just see that I've, fed ChatGPT this prompt. This was a screenshot I took earlier. And here's the response that it gave me, right? So it's given me a list of questions aligned to each of those categories that I asked for. So background questions. So can you walk me through your CV and highlight the most relevant experience for this role? Motivational questions, why are you interested in working here? Okay, so they'd all be very common questions to come up in an interview. You can also anticipate questions based on your CV or application materials that you've sent in. I had an interview before where the interviewers just had my CV in front of me and they just said, talk me through your CV. And then they picked into some bits in more detail, but all the questions were really linked to what I had submitted on my CV. So good to be quite comfortable with the material that you've sent in. The company website can also be a good place to look up information to try and predict interview questions. And so some companies have values that the organisation tries to live by, and sometimes you can get interview questions around them. So again, continuing this example with work, work has these set of 5 values. So for example, going forward and further, thinking freely, thriving on difference, creating connections and sharing opportunities. So if you're looking at this, you, for example, might anticipate a question linked to each of these. So for example, tell me about a time when you built relationships with stakeholders across your organization. And they can also, particularly on bigger organizations, they can also have a careers section where they might include information on the type of interview questions likely to come up. Or sometimes when you've been invited to interview, there might also be information in there about the types of interview questions that are likely to come up. And a final point here is that I think it can also be useful to ask your network. So you might have people that you know working in that organization or working in that type of role, and they might also be a source of information for the type of interview questions likely to come up for that role. It's also good to be aware if you've been invited to a video interview. Okay, so what type of video interview is it? One type of video interview is a live video interview where, like this, you might have somebody on the other end of a Teams or a Zoom call. And the other type is a pre-recorded one where you're not actually talking to a real person, but you're talking to somebody who's pre-recorded those questions. And typically you might get asked 5 to 10 questions, for example, where you might have, 1 or 2 minutes to think about your response, and then you might have 90 seconds to 2 minutes to deliver your answer. It's quite different than a live interview, right? You're not getting that kind of real-time reaction or feedback from your interviewers. And I think it's really good to practice this type of interview because it's quite an unusual kind of interaction, and good to practice those skills so you're used to it. Okay, moving on to our second P, which is preparing interview questions. And there's a couple of things here that I often talk to or recommend clients do. One is to type up your answers. Okay, so once you've this list of predicted interview questions, go through them one by one and type up your responses. The nice thing about typing it up is that you come back, you can iterate, right? You can make it better and improve them over time. Whereas if you write it on paper, you might be a bit more reluctant to, scratch over it or write over it. Whereas when you typed it up, it's really easy to edit. Also, a nice benefit of that is that if you're going to have interviews in the future, nice to come back to that document and have it as a starting point rather than having to start from scratch for every interview that you have. When you're preparing your interviews questions, I think it's really good to think about the structure. Okay, so we're going to talk about the STAR framework and the rule of three. So they're both two types of ways of structuring different types of interview questions. So we're going to go through that in a bit more detail in a minute. And my last point here is it's really good to get feedback. But sometimes we can be a bit too close to this material ourselves. So good to have somebody to maybe read through it and give you some feedback, or later on we'll be talking about practicing and getting feedback that way as well. Okay, so let's look at the STAR framework for competency questions first. Okay, so what is a competency question? Competency question takes the form, tell me about a time when you did something, right? So tell me about a time when you worked on a team project, for example, or had to explain a complex concept to someone, or had to resolve a conflict with a colleague, right? So these are all examples of competency questions, and you can use this STAR framework for all of those questions. The STAR framework, or STAR is an acronym that stands for situation, task, action, and result. Okay, in the situation bit, you're going to be outlining the general situation. So maybe, what was the job that you were in? What was the organization? And maybe what period of time it referred to. The task, you're going to explain what the specific task or goal was. The action is a step-by-step explanation of what you did that demonstrates that skill that they're looking for. And finally, the result is the outcome, which hopefully is something positive or something that you've learned from that experience. Here's a kind of shortened example, right? So in an interview, you probably want to give a much longer answer than this, but this is just to give you a demonstration of how that STAR framework works. So the question here is, tell me about a time when you explained a complex concept. And the situation, alongside my studies, I'm tutoring a 17-year-old student to help her prepare for her economics GCSE exam. The task, she was struggling to understand supply and demand in competitive markets and how to graphically represent them, and my challenge was to help her develop this skill. The action, right, so action words here are important. In order to help her, I listened carefully to understand what she was struggling with and used real-world examples to help her understanding of the issues. I then checked her understanding by asking her to explain the key concepts back to me. Now, in reality, this section will probably be a lot longer, right? So we'd really be showing your ability to explain complex concepts and really break it down into understandable bite-sized chunks. But to fit on the screen, I kind of picked a shortened version. And then the result, at the time, she said she felt more confident with the topic. And when I visited her again last week, she told me she had achieved 75% in a recent test. Lovely. Okay, so that's an example of that STAR framework. Okay, some other bits of just to note here. Okay, so you want to spend about 70% of your answer on that action section, right? Clearly explaining the actions that you took that demonstrate that competency. People often fall into this trap of saying, we did, right? But the recruiter is really listening for what you specifically did, what you contributed to that situation, right? If you're saying we, it's really hard to kind of give you credit for that because it's not clear what you did. And even in the question around teamwork, right? People are like, but I don't want to be taking credit for the teamwork, but you have to be very specific about what you contributed within that team, how you contributed to it being an effective and a nice kind of collaborative environment, for example. people sometimes struggle with this, right? Really kind of expanding into that action section. And I think it can be helpful to kind of sit down with a piece of paper and really mind map the types of behavior that somebody takes who's good at that competency. And then when you have that kind of fleshed out, you can take those behavioral indicators and really weave it into your own answers. So that's something I'd recommend you do if you're finding it hard to kind of expand that action section out. There's a couple of things that can also help with that, right? So besides that mind mapping activity that you might do by yourself, there's also lots of competency frameworks out there, and they often have kind of behavioral indicators of what somebody who's good at whatever competency does. And again, they're things that you could potentially weave into your answer. So for example, the UK Civil Service have this competency framework, and this isn't just relevant for people going for the civil service, right? Other people might use this and find it helpful in developing their interview answers. But this, for example, is a screenshot from part of that framework, and it's on the competency collaborating and partnering. And this is for a level 3 role, right? But they have all these effective behavioral indicators, right? So, for example, act as a team player, investing time to generate a common focus and genuine team spirit, actively seeking input from a diverse range of people. As all of these are indicators that you can potentially incorporate into your answers and give you a bit of inspiration there. ChatGPT, I know it's my favorite thing these days, you can tell, but ChatGPT can also give you a set of behavioral indicators, right? So you can say, what are 10 behavioral indicators for somebody who's good at teamwork, right? And again, they're potentially things that you can incorporate into your answer. So this was another one of these questions that somebody sent in. So thanks very much for that. They're asking, how do you answer this question? Tell me about yourself. And here is a suggested structure for that answer. I think that the rule of 3 works quite well here. So this is kind of structuring things into kind of 3 topics. You can even go into like subtopics within each of them. But again, I think this rule of 3 is a good one to try and stick to as much as possible. People are good at remembering 3 things, right? So that's both for you, right? So when it comes to answer your interview question, you're like, okay, I have to go through this, this, and this. But also for the recruiter listening to you, okay, it's easy for them to remember those 3 points that you've made. So my suggested sections, you can play with this yourself depending on what's going to work for you. But often with clients, I make this recommendation that they first talk me through their education. They then talk me through their work experience. And then they wrap up with a couple of short sentences about why they're interested in this role or their future career goals, for example. I would recommend that you do this in chronological order. So when you're writing a CV, I recommend people do it reverse chronological order, right, with the most recent first. But for this, tell me about yourself. I think you're telling a story. So I think it's nice to start at the beginning and end at what's probably the most relevant and recent thing. And it's also that kind of positive end, right, because you're talking about the role that's most relevant for the job that you're going for, probably. In this, right, you can make an educated decision about how much emphasis you put on each section, right? So if your education is a really big part of your history and it's really relevant for the job that you're going for, you might want to focus a bit more on your education section, right? Maybe go into some details about some of the modules that you've done, some of the relevant technical skills potentially that you've developed through that, maybe some projects or research you were involved in there. Alternatively, if you've really relevant work experience where you can demonstrate that you've developed all these relevant skills or even transferable skills, great to go into that level of detail there. What I'd also say here is try not to kind of repeat yourself, right? So if you've teamwork experience from education and a couple of work experiences, maybe pick one that you think kind of demonstrates that best and use the time then to talk about other skills that you've developed through your career. Okay, so I think I've talked through most of this. Okay, yeah, some things that maybe just a flag here. Okay, so when you're talking through your education, make sure that you're giving enough details that people understand your story, right? So what was the name of the course that you studied, the name of the institution, what time period did that apply to? It's really nice to give sometimes a little bit of insight into your motivation or interest in studying that course. Yeah, as we said, nice to maybe pull out some key skills that you developed and discuss your final year project if it's relevant. With the work, again, I think we've made most of these points. The only thing I haven't talked about here is making sure that the reasons behind your transitions are clear. So I think it's really nice as you go through your story, if you can have a quick one-line sentence that explains why you moved from one role to the other, I think it's nice as well. So people aren't left with those questions wondering kind of why you moved from one role to another. And you had this final bit about, finishing off in this motivation for the role or the future goals. So often with clients, I ask them this question, tell me about yourself. And then they kind of trail off at the end. They say something like, and that's all, and that's me. And that's not a very strong way to answer that question. Whereas if you finish up with a sentence or two around your motivation for applying for this role and how it aligns with your future career goals, I think that's a really positive and nice way to finish up that sentence. Sorry, that answer. Okay, so moving on to practicing interview questions. So we're on our third P, so we're doing well time-wise here. So how can you practice your interview questions? So one thing what I would say is on my previous point and preparing interview questions, I talked about typing up your answers. And one thing I'd say is that you don't want to be trying to remember your answers off by heart, right? You don't want to sound like a robot when you're in there in your interview and really kind of focusing and trying to remember what came next. So you want to be quite familiar with it, but not necessarily have learned it by rote. And in terms of practicing your interview questions, I think there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. So for those of you who are still studying in universities, often universities will have a career development sector where you can, career development center, where you can go and book appointments with careers advisors. And one of the services they usually offer is this mock interview service. So that's one place you could go. Also, sometimes they offer those services to researchers and staff working in the institution. So if you're a staff member at a university, worth potentially reaching out to see if that career development centre can support you as well. Friends and family are often a good source of support also when you're applying for or preparing for interviews, and they can also do a mock interview with you and give you some feedback about how you're coming across. There's interview simulators out there, might be particularly relevant for those of you who might have those pre-recorded video interviews scheduled. And then it's also something you can do by yourself, right? So you can sit in front of the mirror, go through some of these answers. You can audio or video record yourself and listen to yourself back, see how you're coming across. Okay, so there's a couple of different ways to practice it. And what I often say to clients is that you don't want, the first time to be talking through some of these answers to be in the interview itself. Ideally, you'll have gone through it a couple of times and be kind of familiar with this material by the time you get to interview. Okay, so moving on to positive psychology and interviews. Okay, so what we're going to look at here is the benefits of positivity, talking about learned optimism, so how we can become more positive, and that reframing tool. So that's how we can kind of move ourselves from being maybe kind of optimistic more into that realistic or optimistic space. Okay, so one of my favorite TED Talks of all time is this talk by Sean Acker, and he's an organizational psychologist from the US. And he has this lovely message around career development. If anybody has 20 minutes, I would highly recommend you go and have a watch of this. I thought about showing like a 4-minute snippet from it, but I'm not sure what the copyright agreements would say to that. But this is a kind of summary of his TED Talk, right? So we believe we should work hard in order to be happy, but could we be thinking about things backwards? In this fast-moving and very funny talk, psychologist Sean Acker argues that actually happiness inspires us to be more productive. And he also has this slide that he shares during that TED Talk. And he says only 25% of job successes are predicted by IQ. 75% of job successes are predicted by your optimism levels, your social support, and your ability to see stress as a challenge instead of a threat. Right. So I think this is, really an important point, right? He's saying basically that being positive when you're going about, your job in terms of interviewing or the day-to-day of your job, you're more likely to be successful if you're more optimistic. There's also this whole work on learned optimism by Seligman, who is one of these, big contributors to this movement of positive psychology. And this link here is a link to this 6-minute animated summary of a book that he published on learned optimism. And just summarizing, I think one of the big takeaways there for me is that he has this way of kind of categorizing pessimists and optimists, okay, in terms of how they look at things from a permanent, pervasive, and personal perspective. So, for example, a pessimist might think that bad situations are permanent, whereas an optimist will say bad situations are temporary. A pessimist will think that bad situations always happen to me, whereas an optimist says this is just a once-off situation. A pessimist will think that bad situations are my fault, whereas an optimist will think that bad situations are outside my control. And his point is that you can move yourself from being a pessimist to an optimist, right? It's this whole idea of learned optimism. We can move ourselves along this scale. What I might ask you to do here is just to reflect a little bit yourself, where you see yourself on this scale. You know, in the animated book, they also make the point that being too optimistic isn't good either, right? Because if you're too optimistic, let's take this example of interview preparation, you might think, oh, I'm going to do fine. I don't need to do any preparation, right? So that kind of really optimistic side of things probably isn't ideal either. You probably want to be somewhere in this kind of realistic space. But I'll just get you to ask where you think you are on this scale. Okay, and then for those of you who find yourself down in this pessimistic scale, how do we move ourselves into this kind of green zone where we're being a bit more optimistic? We're kind of learning that optimism. And this moves us to this ABCDE model by Albert Ellis that was developed in the 1950s. Okay, so A here, this is a way to reframe, right? And to move ourselves from being kind of pessimistic more into that kind of nice space of being slightly more optimistic or realistic. So A stands for adversity. Okay, so this is the event or situation that triggers those negative thoughts and feelings. B stands for beliefs. So that refers to the thoughts and interpretations that arise in response to that adversity. C is consequences. So the emotional and behavioral impact of those beliefs. D is disputation. So that involves challenging and disputing the negative beliefs with evidence and rational thinking. And finally, E is energization. So the stage where you're observing the positive effects of disputing your negative beliefs, such as a renewed sense of hope or motivation. And if we were to apply this to that very common kind of interview example, right? So for some clients I work with, for example, their adversity might be doing poorly at a previous interview. And they might then have this belief that they are bad at interviews. Okay, what's the consequence of that belief? They might be worried and anxious about their upcoming interview, right? Affecting their preparation, first of all. We also know that, you know, positivity leads to better outcomes from this work by Sean Acker. So it might also affect their future performances. Okay, so now we're going into that reframing stage of it. So I'm going to dispute it first. So that client is not inherently bad at interviewing. Okay, lots of people have interviews that don't go their way at some point throughout their career. And what's the benefit of disputing that? What's that energization stage? So by disputing that belief and believing that interviewing is a skill that they can improve over time, and that like changing that belief can give them more energy to prepare for an interview. They're going to be less worried and more positive. And again, that might also improve how they do an interview, because again, we know that positivity leads to success. So what I might get you to do here is just to take maybe 2 minutes to think about whether this is a model that might apply to your situation in some way. So maybe think about what that adversity is. What are the beliefs that come from that? What are the consequences of that belief? How might you dispute that? And then what's the benefit of disputing that for you? So we're just going to take 2 minutes to think about that. For lots of you, given that you're here, it might be related to interviews, but you know, it might be related to other parts of your work or personal life either. So it's going to take those 2 minutes to do that. Hopefully you've had that opportunity to do that little bit of reframing. I guess what I would say is that this has been life-changing for me. I'm somebody who used to be quite nervous about interviews to the extent I've been losing sleep the night before. It used to make me really very anxious and nervous. And this reframing is something that I've used time and time again, not just in preparing for interviews, but also in other aspects of my life. And I think it's been a complete game changer. So hopefully it'll be useful to some of you as well. Okay, so moving on then to the common interview worries that again come up time and time again with my clients. Okay, so one concern that comes up is this worry that they won't know how to answer a question, or they're going to go blank during that interview. And I would always recommend the clients have a plan about how to handle that situation, okay? And once you have a plan, I think it becomes something that you're not quite so worried about. So I think the first strategy that you can use here is that you could ask the interviewer to repeat the question, or you can ask for a minute to think. And during that minute to think, you're kind of trying to calm yourself down a little bit, and put a bit of structure on how you're going to respond to that question. If you aren't able to come up with a question that time, you could ask them whether you can come back to that question later in the interview. If you are going to use that strategy, I would recommend that you are pretty confident that you are going to be able to come up with an answer during that interview, and you do remember to bring them back to that point. A final strategy is that if you really don't know the answer and you know you're not going to be able to come up with an answer for that question, you can tell them that what you would suggest that you'll do is that you'll try and find out the answer to that question as soon as possible after the interview and come back to them via email if that's all right. Finally, there's some interview questions that come up where there's not a right or wrong answer, right? So sometimes you get these problem-solving questions, like, for example, how much would you charge to wash all the windows in London, for example? And what they're looking for there is often to see your logical approach to something and how you can think through things and maybe even how you handle pressure. So just, talk them through your thinking around that and your logical approach. People are also worried about being asked a question that they haven't anticipated. And what I always tell my clients is that you can never anticipate 100% of questions, right? There's always things that are going to be unpredictable that happens in an interview. But if you've anticipated 8 or 9 out of 10 interview questions, you're probably going to do pretty well in that interview. And then there's just 1 or 2 interview questions that you're going to have to be maybe asking for that bit of time or thinking about how you're going to respond to it. Another thing I would say here that you can also prepare for unanticipated questions, right? This is a skill that you can develop. And for example, what I've done in the past when I've had interviews coming up, I've sometimes Googled a list of difficult interview questions that I haven't read. And then I hit record on my laptop and I move between those 2 things. So I ask myself a difficult question I haven't prepared for, and I'm practicing responding to that on the spot. And again, that's a way that you can develop that skill set of responding to unanticipated questions or unprepared questions. People often feel like they're being judged in an interview, right? And I think that can put a lot of pressure on people and make it a kind of uncomfortable experience. But I'd often encourage people to change their mindset around that, right? Often people like this idea of helping others. So I encourage my clients to think that you're helping the recruiter, right? You're helping them understand you and your background. You can also rather think about, the interview being an opportunity to build that relationship with your potential future colleagues. And also to remember that it's your chance to find out more about them and their organization. You're also going to be thinking at some point down the line whether they're an organization you want to join, right? So it is that 2-way kind of, transaction. I think it's nice to think of the interviewers as being like a supportive friend or family. Like nobody wants to sit through a car crash of an interview, right? They want that interview to go well too. They're spending, 30 minutes to an hour of their time sitting there with you as well. So, interviewers generally want that interview to go well as well. And changing that mindset in terms of how you're approaching that interview, I also think can help your performance. Sorry, excuse me. Often people also come to me and they have this huge pressure that they're putting on themselves, right? They're thinking that this is my only chance to get this job that I really want. And again, I don't think that's a helpful mindset, right? So I encourage them to reframe that a little bit. For example, by thinking, it's only one interview and this company has called you for interview because they've obviously seen that you have the skills and experience required for this role. So it's likely that there'll be other opportunities that will call you for interview in the future as well. And people are often worried, they're feeling stressed and nervous and they're worried that that's going to impact their interview performance on the day. And I would say 2 things here. First of all, recognizing that stress can actually improve your performance, right? So feeling a little bit of stress, a little bit of anxiety is probably what's going to motivate you to go and do all this interview preparation, right? And to be ready and prepared for that interview on the day. Secondly, if that stress is getting to the point where it's hampering you, I'd come back to that ABCDE model, right? Become aware of that inner dialogue and your beliefs and dispute it and get that benefit of that energization from that reframing. Okay, so moving on to the Q&A section. So again, thanks everybody for sending in those questions. So these are 5 questions that I didn't answer during the webinar, but I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on now. So everybody's so clued up in interviews. How do I stand out? 2, how to answer situational questions I haven't experienced. 3, what kinds of questions should I be asking the interviewer? 4, what's a suitable dress code for women, especially in summertime? And how to address employment gaps. So all really good questions, and we're going to go through them one by one now. So first of all, everyone is so clued up on interviews. How do I stand out? I guess what I'd say is this is not my view of people's level of preparation and skills in interviewing. Again, I've worked with over 200 people, and I would say very few people are coming in with like really strong interviewing skills where there's no room for improvement. I also think that it's not a very helpful mindset, right? So if you're kind of going into that interview going, oh my gosh, everybody's so good at interviewing, how am I going to stand out? It's not such a useful way to kind of be supporting yourself through that. So that's another one of those kind of inner dialogues or beliefs that maybe you might want to think about reframing. I also talk a lot to my clients about controlling your controllables. So, who else is interviewing for that job and how well they do in their interviews is outside of your control, right? What you control is how you're approaching it and your performance within that interview. Okay, so we talked through those 4 Ps, I think, and the other tips that we talked about, I think they help you kind of in that preparation for doing well at interview. I also think, it's good to enjoy that interview, aim to enjoy it, aim to build that relationship with those future potential colleagues. I think it's nice to show your enthusiasm and motivation in a genuine way. Often I might do a mock interview with somebody and they might be telling me about things that they've achieved in the past or strengths that they're really good at, but they're doing it with like a blank face. And I think it's normal to kind of smile when you're talking through those things. People expect your body language to reflect what you're saying. And then I guess the final thing I'd say is that, you can also think about, how do you stand out? You can also think about building your experience and fit more generally, right? How you do in that interview is only one piece of that puzzle. You could also be thinking about building your CV. So, for example, maybe getting stepping stone roles that get you that bit closer to your goal. You could also be thinking about whether there's any ways you could be upskilling if there's any gaps in your skill set compared to what they're looking for. Or you might kind of find some relevant volunteering roles either that are helping build your profile and skills for the roles that you want in the future. Okay, the second question, how best to answer situational questions that I haven't experienced? So, for example, tell me about a difficult situation at work. So what I would first recommend people do here is maybe spend a bit of time again with that piece of paper and a pen, really thinking about whether there are experiences you can draw on here, right? Often again with clients, I'll be talking to them, they'll say, oh no, I've not really any examples I can use here. But then when you start digging into them and you start asking questions about their experiences, often you do come up with a couple of really strong examples that they can use to respond to those questions. Like if you can't come up with those examples, you can say that you don't have direct experience of it, but you could talk about how you could hypothetically deal with that situation. Sorry. A third approach might be to discuss a similar situation. So, maybe you haven't faced a difficult situation at work, but maybe you have experienced a difficult situation at an extracurricular activity or through some of your studies, for example. And maybe you can, flag that you haven't experienced in work, but you can talk about this other difficult experience that you experienced, this difficult experience that you had in a different situation. And then finally, again, it's kind of coming back to this other point that, if there are these situational questions that you're really struggling to answer, maybe it's a bit about trying to build up your experience and your CV so that you do have more things that you can draw on for these interview questions. So, for example, you might want to engage in some voluntary work. Again, you maybe think about these stepping stone roles or taking on additional responsibilities in your current role. What kinds of questions should I be asking the interviewer? So there's 3 things I usually tell clients here. First of all, ask questions that you genuinely want to know the answer to, right? I was in an interview before and I just asked some random question at the end, just for the sake of it almost. And they gave me this really well thought out answer. Because I wasn't interested, I could literally feel my eyes glazing over, right? And that's not a good look in interviews. So ask a question that you genuinely want to know the answer to. Secondly, ask a question that you cannot find the answer to online, or if you could have Googled it online, that's not a good question to answer, ask an interview. And finally, make sure that it's a question that continues to show your motivation and enthusiasm, right? So throughout that interview, you've been coming across as well prepared, motivated, enthusiastic. And then they say, okay, do you have any questions for us? And you want to kind of make sure that you're continuing that that level of motivation and enthusiasm for the role. So I'd usually recommend people don't ask about things like benefits or salaries at this stage of the conversation for that reason. So some examples of questions that I think are good at the end of an interview. And what does a typical week look like in this role? What are the key priorities or challenges for the team over the next 6 months? Can you tell me a bit more about the structure of the team I'd be working with and how that role fits into the wider organizational structure? Right, all really interesting questions that show your real interest in understanding that role and how you'd fit in and contribute to it. 4, what's a suitable dress code for women, especially in summertime? This person isn't so keen on dresses and skirts. So here I cheated and asked my best friend, ChatGPT, and I think the response is pretty good. And probably more thorough than what I could give here. So I don't want to spend too long talking about this. So I probably will direct you to ChatGPT, having read their response and verifying that it's pretty good. As always with ChatGPT though, right, do make sure that you are critically assessing any information that you get. So for example, this ChatGPT prompt I put in, what is suitable interview attire for a woman in the UK during the summer? And I would say that the text that it gave was really good and really helpful. And then it said, oh, do you want to follow some image links for more information? I said, yeah. So I clicked through the image links, but I would say some of them I didn't think were that appropriate for interviewing. Like some of them, I don't think that the neckline was kind of modest enough, for example. So do apply your own critical thinking to anything that you're getting out of ChatGPT. So, again, here's the prompt I gave it: what is suitable interview attire for a woman in the UK during the summer? And here's its response. Right, so it talked about smart trousers or a skirt. It's talking about lightweight materials such as linen or cotton in neutral colours like navy, beige, or black. It's talking about a blouse or a shirt. It's talking about short or 3/4 length sleeve blouse in a breathable fabric. Also talking about a light blazer or a jacket. That's optional, but I would say that that's probably a good idea, particularly if it's a warm day, for example, but you might be interviewed in an air-conditioned office and maybe nice to have that option to layer up. And I cut it off, right? So this was just a screenshot. There was more information in that ChatGPT response, so I would recommend people go and have a look on that. Okay, and then the last pre-submitted question was this question around how to address employment gaps. And I guess what I'd say about this is ideally you'll have addressed this on your cover letter and your CV and your application material. There is also this good resource here that you can access on how to handle those gaps on your CV and cover letter, and also applies to interviews. I guess what I'd say is that it's good to be honest, strategic, and positive. So, for example, can you talk about or focus on, how you use that time during those gaps to develop other skills, maybe a bit about what you learned from those experiences. And I think, obviously this person has done it, and I think it's really good to do it, is to predict questions around those gaps, right? And to prepare your responses, practice them, and apply that kind of positivity as well. So again, I'd be anticipating questions around any gaps in my CV and making sure that you are comfortable kind of talking through them. Okay, so I have about 5 minutes left on the call, so I might just have a quick look at the chat, the Q&A that have come in, and let me see if there's any questions maybe I can quickly answer in the last couple of minutes. Okay, so there's a question here: would asking whether there will be a trial period after being hired be a question that will create a negative impression when they want to learn about the probation period? Again, personally, that would be one of those questions I probably would hold off until the later stage. That's something that you could ask HR, for example, when you get offered that job. And the reason that I would say that is, again, you've had that kind of impression of being positive and enthusiastic and motivated and all of that. And it just might create some red flags at the end of that interview, because they might kind of have that perception that you might be worried about not passing probation, for example. So if it was me and if it was something that was important, I'd hold off on asking that until maybe I've gotten offered that job and I can ask that with HR. I mean, ideally, in the best case scenario, they'll already have informed you about this beforehand, right? So often the job description will include information about that. And I would say that's, the best case scenario. But yeah, I'd avoid asking that in interview. How do you justify a downward step in terms of the role you're applying for? I'm concerned that their worry would be your commitment to the role and time you will stay. My reason would be to reduce the stress demands of the role to enable PhD completion. Yeah, so I think this is one of those ones where you want to be kind of honest, but also strategic, right? So I think you need to think about what the needs of that employer is. Like, so they probably don't want somebody who's just going to stay for 6 months, say, and then leave once their PhD is done. So you probably want to be a bit strategic in terms of how you manage that response. Um, but yeah, I would develop something that's genuine and authentic, but is also strategic in that case. Okay, I'm just a bit aware of the time, so I'm going to come back just to our kind of final tip and summary, and apologies to anybody whose questions I didn't get to there. But just to kind of summarize what we talked about and maybe share some final tips. So we talked about this 4P approach to interview preparation, where the 4Ps were predicting interview questions, preparing your responses, practicing them, and that positive psychology and the benefits that that can offer for your interview performance. Some other kind of final tips I'd like to share. I think it's really good to have your interview outfit planned ahead of time. Maybe even have a spare blouse or shirt in the bag that you're bringing with you in case you end up with a coffee spill or something on you when you're waiting for your interview. I think it's really nice to have a treat planned for afterwards, so, I don't know if you really like have a nice slice of cake and a fancy cappuccino or something like that in a nearby coffee shop, or whether you have your favorite takeaway planned for that evening, for example, because I think it helps again with that kind of, approaching interviews with that kind of positivity and happiness. I think arrive in plenty of time. You don't want to be rushed or stressed out arriving at that interview. Often there's coffee shops nearby where your interview is going to take place. So, go and have a nice calming cup of peppermint tea or something beforehand. Smile, during your interview, can release like positive endorphins, and remember to breathe. It kind of relax you. And the final point I'd say here is challenge yourself to enjoy interviews. It is possible. And it's one thing I always challenge my interview clients to do, is to enjoy the whole process, right? Enjoy the preparation, enjoy sitting outside that interview room, enjoy the interview itself. And that's something you can really challenge yourself to do, again, with this reframing and this ABCDE model that we talked about. And I think if that's something that you can achieve, I think it's a complete game changer in terms of your career development. Okay, so just some final notes. So the recording of this webinar will be available and shared through a follow-up email from the team at jobs.ac.uk. And thanks very much to the team for all the technical support and setting everything up, and for the invite to be here as well. That recording is also going to be available on their careers advice section on the jobs.ac.uk website. If you thought this resource is going to be helpful with your network, please do feel free to share. And to do that, you can visit their website, jobs.ac.uk, and share on social media. On behalf of jobs.ac.uk, thanks very much for watching, and I hope that you found the information shared today helpful. And finally, goodbye and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.